Hello, and welcome to ELA Plus, your free supplemental guide to the English language arts. I'm your host, Brian E. Denton. In today's video lesson, we're going to read and analyze Shakespeare's Sonnet number 3. This is the perfect poem for anyone concerned about the aging process. If you're interested at all, young or old, in learning how to reverse the awful ravages of time's immortal wasteful march, then this poem is for you. It's also one of the few poems I'm aware of where the poet successfully analogizes the tender and loving romantic union of a man and woman to the agricultural production function. That's why he's the bard, folks. Let's take a look. We'll start our study of William Shakespeare's Sonnet number 3 by reading the poem. After that, we'll define the archaic words that Shakespeare uses, and then I'll offer a contemporary plain English reading of the poem so your understanding of the surface meaning of this sonnet is firmly rooted. Then, before our analysis, we'll talk about the couplet tie, and we'll also discuss a little bit about how sonnet number 3 fits into the sonnet cycle as a whole. After that, we'll be ready for a deep analysis of the poem, and we'll conclude with some comprehension questions. As you may already know, we have a method for reading poetry here at the channel, and that method includes reading the poetry first to ourselves and then reading it aloud. If you're interested at all in learning how to read poetry intelligently, please see our video lesson, How to Read a Poem. It's linked to down in the description below. I'm assuming you've already read this poem to yourself, so let's read it aloud together. Look in thy glass, and tell the face thou viewest. Now is the time that face should form another, whose fresh repair, if now thou not renewest, thou dost beguile the world, unbless some mother. For where is she so fair, whose uneared womb disdains the tillage of thy husbandry? Or who is he so fond will be the tomb of his self-love to stop posterity? Thou art thy mother's glass, and she in thee calls back the lovely April of her prime. So thou, through windows of thine age, shalt see, despite of wrinkles, this thy golden time. But if thou live remembered not to be, die single, and thine image dies with thee. All right, that's Shakespeare's Sonnet number 3. Now, as with all of Shakespeare, it generally takes a little bit more effort and a little bit more thought to even get a surface understanding of what he's writing. And so at the channel, what we like to do is review some of the archaic language or the obscure words that Shakespeare uses. And in doing so, this allows us to get that surface understanding down so we can move on to our deeper analysis. Now, there are 3 such archaic or obscure words in this poem, and I've highlighted them here for you. Those words are glass, uneared, and fond. Now, glass is a word that is familiar to us all, I'm sure. It is, after all, what windows are made out of. You know, a kind of translucent or transparent, amorphous, inorganic substance. Now, that's the common definition of the word glass. In sonnet number 3, Shakespeare, or more specifically the speaker, is using glass in one of 2 ways. The word glass in sonnet number 3 can either mean a mirror or an hourglass. Let's start with mirror, because to me that makes the most sense. After all, in the opening line of this poem, we have the speaker imploring the young man to take a look in this glass, the mirror, and tell the face he sees there that now's the time to get to baby making. The word glass also appears in line 9, when the speaker tells the young man that he, the young man, is his mother's glass, that is, her mirrored reflection. So this speaks to the idea that the passing on of genetic inheritance serves as a kind of mirror between the generations, wherein the generations can see themselves reflected in one another. So that's one definition we have of the word glass. It's a mirror. But as we said before, there's another meaning of the word glass in this poem. Stephen Booth points out in his book, Shakespeare's Sonnets, that in sonnet number 3, the word glass can also mean hourglass. And this is fitting, given that time is a major thematic concern in this sonnet cycle. An hourglass, for those of you who don't know, is a device with 2 symmetrical compartments connected by a small aperture. The compartments are filled with sand, and the sand is designed in such a way to fall through the aperture over the course of a set period of time. So what is Booth's justification for glass meaning hourglass in sonnet number 3? Well, as I just said, time is a major thematic concern for the sonnet cycle as a whole, but also particularly for sonnet number 3. Remember that in this poem, the speaker tells the young man that now is the time for that face to form another. It's time to procreate. Your biological clock is ticking. You need to make this baby and pass on your beauty to the future. Also, again, down in line number 9, the speaker tells the young man that thou art thy mother's glass, and she in thee calls back the lovely April of her prime. Here, the act of procreation resets the hourglass. It flips it over and gets the time running again, allowing more time for the young man's genetic material, his beauty, to exist in the world. And so that's what the speaker means when he uses the word glass in sonnet number 3. He's either referring to a mirror or an hourglass. Now let's take a look at uneared. This is a tricky one to explain, and I think it's best to first understand that what Shakespeare is doing is creating an agricultural metaphor for sexual reproduction, as one does. For now, just think of an ear of corn to understand what uneared means. To ear, in an agricultural context, means to become fruit-bearing. It's an expression that we use in order to describe the process of forming ears in a grain-bearing plant like wheat or corn. So when one of these plants has eared, what that means is that it's become fruit-bearing, it's become fruitful. In other words, it is reproduced. So an uneared womb, then, is a womb that has not been fertilized. A womb that, to quote the bard, has not enjoyed the tillage of husbandry. Parenthetically, guys, girls love poetry. They swoon for it. So be sure to quote to any female interest of yours the immortal lines of Shakespeare's sonnet number 3. You will look ever so sophisticated and sensitive when you tell them that you want to ear their wombs with the tillage of your husbandry. Dating tips aside, let's now move on to the third and final obscure or archaic word in sonnet number 3. And that word, of course, is fond. Now, fond is a lot like the word glass in the respect that there's a common definition that we're all familiar with. To be fond of someone is to have an intense liking for them. But in sonnet number 3, there's another definition of the word fond, and that definition is foolish. This, then, is the speaker's rhetorical question for the young man in quatrain number 2. Who is foolish enough to commit suicide by failing to reproduce? Great. That concludes our discussion of the archaic or obscure words in Shakespeare's sonnet number 3. So now we're ready to develop our plain English rendering of this poem. Let's do that now on a quatrain by quatrain basis. Quatrain 1. Take a good look at yourself in this mirror and tell yourself that now is the time to make a baby. Because if you don't, your now fresh, beautiful face will grow old and ugly, and you'll be denying the world your beauty, but also you'll be denying some woman the opportunity to bear your child. Quatrain 2. After all, surely no woman exists who is so proud that she would refuse you a child. And what man, given that fact, would be foolish enough not to reproduce, lost in his own self-absorbed narcissism? Quatrain 3. You are a mirror to your mother, because when she looks at you, she recalls her youth. So too, if you have a child, you'll be able to relive your youth and old age. Couplet. But if you do not reproduce, you won't leave a child behind to remember you, and your image will be forgotten. So that's it. Basically, what's going on at the surface level of this poem is this. The speaker is telling the young man, yes, you're beautiful now. You're lively and you're lovely, but this isn't going to last. Eventually, you're going to get old and die. So the only way to preserve this youthful beauty is to reproduce. That way, you can see yourself in your child just as your mother sees herself in you right now. And I'm warning you, again, if you don't reproduce out of vanity and self-obsession, you will die and the memory of you will die. And now that we've read the poem, discussed the archaic and obscure words, and also articulated a plain English reading of the poem, we're now ready to talk about the couplet tie and to situate the poem within the context of the larger sonnet cycle as a whole. In terms of the couplet tie, there is no couplet tie, and I'm going to go full English major on you on this point later in the analysis portion of the video lesson. In terms of where sonnet number 3 fits into the sonnet cycle as a whole, We're still in the young man portion of the sonnet cycle, and we're still in the procreation portion of the sonnet cycle. So the two main characters are the speaker and the young man, and the speaker is urging the young man to make some babies. And now it's time for our analysis of sonnet number 3. And there are 4 things that I'd like to draw your attention to here. First is the major theme of the poem. That major theme is, of course, those things that are life-dealing and those things that are death-dealing. There's also another thematic concern in this poem, and that thematic concern is those things that pertain to vision and to sight. Furthermore, it's very important to understand the metaphorical vehicles that carry these themes, and that metaphorical vehicle is the agricultural metaphors. And finally, we're going to talk about the couplet tie, or more accurately, the lack of a couplet tie. Let's start with the major theme of this poem, which is the theme of life and death, or more specifically, those things that are life-dealing and those things that are death-dealing. Life is all over the sonnet. It starts right in the first quatrain. The speaker demands that the young man look into the mirror and create a new life. The quatrain even closes with the word mother, the being who gave life to us all. These, the desire to procreate and motherhood, are both life-dealing concepts. The second quatrain continues with this theme of life and life-dealing things. The tillage of husbandry, for example, is farming. Farming is a life-dealing occupation. And the quatrain ends with the word posterity. Clearly, posterity, future generations, has life or life-dealing implications. But also in this quatrain, right smack in the middle of the poem, we have the first language dealing with death and death-dealing. Here the speaker asks the young man, who is he so fond will be the tomb of his self-love to stop posterity? It's very clear what the speaker is saying here. He's saying that to deny life, to deny the life-dealing aspects of life, is to deal in death, to deal in death-dealing. To cut off posterity, then, is to end in the tomb. So a lesser poet would say, get in that womb to avoid the tomb. The speaker abandons any talk of death or death-dealing in the third quatrain, however, opting instead to focus on those things that are life-dealing again. Mothers, lovely April prime, golden time. And then in the couplet, the speaker makes explicit what is only hinted at in the second quatrain. Here's what he says. But if thou live remembered not to be, die single, and thine image dies with thee. In other words, as we said before, if the young man does not embrace life and life-dealing activities, tilling those wombs, so to speak, then he will encounter final death. So here in the final couplet, we get both death-dealing and life-dealing. The death-dealing is made explicit. The speaker tells the young man that if he doesn't reproduce, then not only will he not be remembered, but his image will die. And this is the speaker's solution to the problem of aging. He's telling the young man that in order to combat the withering effects of old age and preserve his youth, he's got to reproduce. More specifically, he has to engage during his life in life-dealing activities. Another theme that you may have noticed in this poem is that this sonnet relies heavily on the sense of sight. Vision and sight infuse sonnet number 3. Right there in the beginning, the speaker asks the young man to look into a mirror. And what does a mirror do? It reflects. It reflects images. Something to see, something for sight to interpret. This sight, of course, being the young man's visage, which the speaker wants to see reproduced in another. It's also very interesting to note when the speaker either does or does not reference the sense of sight in this poem. As we've seen, he definitely references the sense of sight in the first quatrain, but in the second quatrain, he does not. And then in the third quatrain, he references sight 3 times. In the final concluding couplet, of course, he does not mention sight at all in the first line, but he does in the second line. And I think there's very good reason for this. What Shakespeare is doing here, I'd say, is having the speaker only reference vision or sight in those portions of sonnet number 3 that are associated with life-dealing activities. So, as we've already established, the first quatrain is wholly life-dealing. We have talk about procreation, and we have talk about motherhood. And so we get this reference to sight in the very first line. Moving along to the second quatrain, however, it's totally death-dealing. We have talk about the tomb and the stopping of posterity, and there's no reference to sight. It's as if Shakespeare is suggesting that in death, there's nothing to see. Of course, in the third quatrain, we're right back to the life-dealing. We have the return of motherhood and also of glass or mirror. And in fact, the words glass and mother are closely associated in sonnet number 3. And in addition to motherhood and glass, we also have this reference to a window, which obviously is also associated with vision and sight. The couplet then wraps up both of these themes very neatly. Life and death on the one hand, and the sense of sight on the other. In the first line of the couplet, the speaker tells the young man that if you live without leaving an heir, then you'll be forgotten. And then he concludes by saying that if you die single, your image dies with you. So, if death-dealing life, then no image. The obvious implication here is that if you live a life-dealing existence, then image. Okay, so we have life and death, life-dealing and death-dealing, and also the sense of sight as the two major thematic elements of sonnet number 3. And now it's time to talk about the major metaphors of sonnet number 3. The most important metaphor, of course, is the agricultural metaphor found in the second quatrain. And this is funny because, as you know, the English sonnet is intimately associated with notions of romance and romantic love and sensuality. And here comes old Big Willie Shakes swaggering into the room saying, you know what, the way to ear a woman's womb is to get her to desire the tillage of your husbandry. Gentlemen, if this isn't the line you use the next time you're out at the club, I don't know what I can do for you. I mean, what do we study the classics for if not to discover the eternal truths of human existence? One of which being that women simply cannot resist being compared to vegetable produce. Joking aside, if you haven't seen it already, you should note that the word husbandry here is a pun. Husbandry in the sense of the production and management of plants and animals, and husbandry in the sense of being a husband, that is, performing a husband's reproductive duties, shall we say. Being fruitful and multiplying, if you want to get biblical about it. You know, before we move on to our discussion of the lack of a couplet tie in sonnet number 3, I just want to say that this is not a one and done for William Shakespeare in terms of his sexualization of agricultural practices. Eventually on this channel, we're going to read the play Antony and Cleopatra, and that play features a much more explicit sexual metaphor involving agriculture. In Scene 2, Act 2 of that play, a bunch of people are gathered together and they're discussing Cleopatra's sexual escapades. One of them says, "She made the great Caesar lay his sword in bed. He plowed her, and she cropped." He plowed her? William, is that kind of talk appropriate for our public schools? That particular issue of educational public policy aside, it's now time to discuss the lack of a couplet tie in sonnet number 3, and on this topic, I'm going to go full English major on you. The first thing that you need to understand is that nearly all of the 154 sonnets in this sonnet cycle feature a couplet tie. So sonnet number 3 is quite unique in this respect in that it doesn't have a couplet tie. In a sense, then, there's a break with the other sonnets in this cycle. With that in mind, let's now look at something important that the speaker is arguing in this poem, and how this may relate to the lack of a couplet tie. Each of the 3 quatrains in this sonnet features some variation on the theme of motherhood. In the first quatrain, to not reproduce is to unbless some mother. In the second quatrain, we have that really great image of the uneared womb. And then in the third quatrain, the speaker says that the young man is the glass that his mother looks into to see her own youth reflected. And that in turn, if the young man reproduces, then he too will be able to look at his progeny and see his own youth reflected. So we have the idea of motherhood appearing in all 3 quatrains of this sonnet. But only when the word mother itself appears do we also have the use of the word glass or mirrors. In the first quatrain, the speaker tells the young man to look into the glass and tell the face that he sees there that it's time to reproduce, or he unbless some mother. Then in the third quatrain, we have this idea of the glass reintroduced, and the speaker says that the young man is the mother's glass, and also that he, the young man, is the mother's glass or mirror too. So now we have this idea set up of mirrors as a kind of generational reflective device. Now picture two such mirrors facing each other. This produces an infinite view of the biological line, all down throughout the generations and into the future. But what happens if the young man does not heed the speaker's advice and reproduce? Well, then that generational line is extinguished. One of the mirrors is removed, and that once infinite biological line is broken. The lack of a couplet tie, tying the quatrain to the couplet, I argue, is a thematically apropos similar break. And that's me going full English major, ladies and gents. Let's move on to the comprehension questions. Here's some questions to get you thinking more deeply about the poem and ready for any potential classroom discussion that you may have. Consider answering them down in the comments below. Question number 1. Who are the characters in this poem? Question number 2. Where are we in terms of the sonnet cycle as a whole? Question number 3. What are the major metaphors and themes of this poem? Question number 4. What do you think, if anything, about the lack of a couplet tie? And question number 5. What do you personally think about this poem? I'm very interested to see about your answer to this question, so let me know. All right, that concludes our lesson on Shakespeare's Sonnet number 3. I hope you enjoyed it and that you learned something from it. If you did, please subscribe to the channel and like the video. We have a lot more content on the way, and the more subscribers and views we get, the faster we can create content. To that end, also consider sharing it with friends, fellow students, and even your English teacher. If you have any questions about this video or other questions about your English language arts studies in school, please do not hesitate to ask down in the comments. I'm available, and I'll do my best to offer high-quality answers to anything you might want to know. Remember that ELA Plus is a free, regularly updated supplemental guide to the English language arts. Subscribe to learn more. Until our next lesson, keep reading, get obsessed, and take care of yourselves and others. Thank you.